and welcome to the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy 2022 Tansley Lecture. My name is Melissa Fromm, and I'm an online MPA student with Johnson Shoyama, and I'm the president and CEO for Junior Achievement of Southern Alberta, a nonprofit organization dedicated to teaching financial literacy, work readiness, and entrepreneurship skills to the next generation of leaders. I am honored to be your MC today for the Tansley Lecture. I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical home is located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. I am joining from my home territory of Treaty 7, home to the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Nakota and Tsuut'ina nations. And our speakers today are joining us from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and it's now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people. We pay our respects to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit ancestors of these places as we reaffirm our relationships with one another. We're so glad to welcome those of you joining us today from across Turtle Island, and we make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. Knowing that we have people joining us from across the country, I would be remiss if I didn't take a minute to say a little bit about our school. The Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, as we prefer to say, is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy and administration. With campuses at both the University of Saskatchewan and University of Regina, JSGS's graduate and executive development programs build knowledge, skills, and competencies for success in government, nonprofits, and cooperatives and credit unions. Nationally recognized for our professional training and research excellence, JSGS is responding to the needs of the public sector partners, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit organizations, government and communities who are confronted with economic and social and environmental issues. Through events like today's Tansley Lecture, JSGS is bringing together thought leaders, academics, students, and community members to listen and to learn about current issues affecting Canadians. JSGS has had a busy year, and we would like to take some time to share just a few of our successes and achievements with you. In May, JSGS released its Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategy. This is going to help our school modeling the way for future policy leaders to confront 21st century policy challenges. Our executive education team had an impactful year, connecting with over 2,000 students while expanding reach into some new and interesting areas. This included launching an online asynchronous board revision training program for members, chairs, and secretaries of boards of revision across Saskatchewan, launching the Kiskiyatomowina First Nations University of Canada Board of Governance program in partnership with the First Nations University of Canada. And we continue policy workshop programs, which has been in place since 2008 and held more than 70 workshops with over 1,500 spots filled by public servants from across the province, exploring issues of risk, public service ethics, wicked problems, and problem measurement. Our community engagement team has kept busy too. They hosted 28 lectures on the topics of equity, diversity, and inclusion, advancing reconciliation in the justice system, how to improve Canada's healthcare system, and more. Connected with over 3,500 registrants at these online discussions. The Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives conducted a census and published a report on Canada's renewable energy cooperatives to better understand the role it currently plays and could play in Canada's energy transition. Our faculty continue to have significant impact as well. Amy Zarzensky, CSIP research lead in health innovation policy, was awarded $704,000 from Stem Cell Network for research to inform policy and oversight mechanisms for regenerative medicine. Cheryl Camillo and Ramona Kabiagu and colleague Tim McKay received SHRF Sante Award for top solutions programs. Their research examined how technology can improve the delivery of home care. Peter Phillip, CSIP's director, released his book, Ideas, Institutions, and Interests, which examines science, technology, and innovation policy in Canada's pan-continental system. And not to be outdone, our students, have also been completing research and putting their education to use. Valerie McLeod, JSGS Genie in student, in partnership with Academy and community advisors, used her master's project to address the systemic pressures that Indigenous women sometimes face after giving birth. JSGS National Case Competition team, composed of Heather Barlow, Irina Lorenovich, Abimolo Ojo, Sujant Sharma, with alternates Sheldon Grant and Anastasia Kalugina, placed second in the Kappa National Public Administration Case Competition. And Kwaku Aisi took home first place at the U of R's 3-minute thesis competition after presenting this thesis on decolonization and child welfare in just 3 minutes and using one slide, proving that sometimes policy change can be made simple. Before I continue, I have to say apologies to anyone whose name I have mispronounced, because I feel like there was a lot of big names in that list of accomplishments. If you are interested in reading more about what JSGS has been up to over this last year, Karen will post a link in the chat for you. Now, for myself, over the last 2 years, as part of the first graduating class of the JSGS online MPA program, I have been immersed in learning about public policy and public policy implementation. And the wonderful thing about public policy is that there's always a current issue to dissect and debate and solve. In some ways, I feel like I've completed a master's degree in COVID policy, because there was so much conversation and debate and so much to discover and unravel about COVID in the last 2 years. This is a topic that has confounded so many governments at so many levels around the world. I am so excited to hear from our honorable guest today on the topic of smart cooperative action for a better future, because I don't know that there's been a time in history that has been more relevant. Before we move on to our keynotes today, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. We do kindly ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off your videos during the presentation portion. Please feel free to turn your video on for the Q&A. The format for today's event will be the following. Following opening remarks, our speakers, the Honourable Anne McLellan and the Honourable Lisa Raitt, will engage in a fireside chat discussion for 30 minutes. For the remaining time, our speakers will entertain honest audience questions moderated by Jim Farney, Director and Associate Professor at JSGS. Following that Q&A, we'll present the 2022 JSGS Mentor Award. If you'd like to ask questions to the presenters, we ask that you use the Zoom chat function to submit your questions directly to Jim. Because we have such a large audience today and so little time, we want to encourage you to keep your questions concise and to the point so that the speakers can respond to as many questions as possible. If you have any logistical issues during today's presentation, don't hesitate to reach out to Karen Jaster-LaForge via the chat function or by email at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. Today's lecture is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website. I'm now pleased to introduce Laleen Burdal, JSGS Executive Director, who's going to provide some background information on the Tansley lecture. Dr. Burdal, over to you.
Well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you everyone for being here. It's so wonderful to have all of you with us for this event. Before I get too far into the event, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge the contributions of my colleague, Doug Moen, who's here with us today. He is going to be stepping down as Director of Executive Education on June 30th, but not to fear, he's not going too far. He's resuming his role as a JSGS Executive in Residence. So for those of you who are familiar with Doug, you will know that he has played a very remarkable and instrumental role in our school. He joined JSGS in 2016 after a 30-plus career in the public service, and he has been instrumental in assisting the school in expanding our relationships with government partners in Saskatchewan and with our institutional partners at the First Nations University of Canada. Under his guidance, the school extended its academic and executive programming to support those working in the public, nonprofit, and cooperative sectors, and within many First Nations communities. Doug's tireless efforts in supporting our students as an instructor, mentor, and champion for the JSGS's internship program have had far-reaching positive impacts for every student who has gone through our program since he has joined. We have been very, very grateful to benefit from his leadership and expertise, and I feel very fortunate that he has agreed to remain on with the school in this different capacity as executive in residence. So while this is by no means a goodbye, I would like us to take just a moment to thank Doug for the positive impact he has had on our school with a round of applause. And so I know that Melissa asked everybody to stay muted. I'm going to ask you to ignore her for 1 second, unmute yourself, and please join me in saying thanks to Doug for some applause. Feel free to throw some hearts emojis onto the screen. Doug, we are so thankful for you. So I won't call on you for an impromptu speech, but please note how much you are valued by the school. So today we are going to hear the 14th annual Tansley Lecture presentation. And this annual event is called the Tansley Lecture to honor the late Donald D. Tansley for his remarkable career as a senior public servant in Canada. Donald Tansley, an alum of the University of Saskatchewan, began his career as a public servant with the Government of Saskatchewan in the Budget Bureau under the guidance of Al Johnson. Throughout his career, Mr. Tansley was known for leading some of the most complex and contentious files in the provincial government, from rescuing IPSCO from bankruptcy to implementing Medicare in Saskatchewan, to leading the modernization of the provincial government in New Brunswick and implementing highly controversial policies such as the Program of Equal Opportunity. In 1968, Mr. Tansley moved to the Federal Public Service, where he served as Vice President of the Canadian International Development Agency, advisor to the Red Cross, CEO of the controversial Anti-Inflation Board, and finally, he led the development of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Whatever the challenge, Donald Tansley's character and commitment to the public service always shone through. He could often be heard encouraging his colleagues to preserve and finish the task at hand and to take harsh judgments with a grain of salt. So, with that understanding of the Tansley Lecture's namesake and the history of the Tansley Lecture, I am very pleased to invite Jim Farney to introduce today's speakers. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Lolene, and welcome everybody. It's a delight to see you. If I can just riff off of the point about concise questions, this is the first time we've ever done the Tansley virtually, and the piece that I'm going to miss is when we did it in person, I could have wonderful, plausibly deniable conversations with people about what was said. We can't do that virtually, at least not easily. So if you've got disagreements with the speakers, those are also welcome. Just don't disguise the disagreements as a question. It makes it hard for me to parse. I'd like to have a really lively discussion when we get to that point. And the livelier the discussion I see in the chat, the sooner I'll stop talking and start channeling your questions to the two really exciting speakers we've got with us today. So the Honourable Anne McLellan and Honourable Lisa Raitt probably need no real introduction, but I am going to ask them when I'm done my little spiel here to introduce the Coalition for a Better Future, which I think is this really exciting project they've got on the go that's pulled in a lot of partners, and it's the partnership piece that I find fascinating. The Honourable Anne McLellan served 4 terms as the Liberal MP for Edmonton Centre, and I see Ralph Goodale's on the call. Ralph is probably the only person who understands quite what that means. She was Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Minister of Safety and Emergency Preparedness, of Health, of Justice and Attorney General, and Minister of Natural Resources. In 2006, she joined Bennett Jones LLP, and she serves on the board of the Summit Raitt and Invest Alberta Corporation. She's got a long list of community commitments as well. Pearson College, the TELUS Edmonton Community Board, and the Institute for Public Policy. She also serves on the board of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. In 2009, she was appointed an officer of the Order of Canada. And in 2013, she received the Alberta Order of Excellence. Prior to joining government, she was a professor in the University of Alberta's Faculty of Law and served there as Associate Dean and Acting Dean of the faculty. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a law degree from Dalhousie and a Master of Laws degree from King's College, London. The Honourable Lisa Raitt joined CIBC Capital Markets in January 2020 after a long career in both public and private sectors on different roles. Today for CIBC, she focuses on senior client coverage and business development with clients in the energy, infrastructure, and industrial sectors. Prior to that, prior to joining CIBC, she was CEO and president of the Toronto Port Authority, which is one of those exciting bits of infrastructure we always forget about, but I'm sure created some stories. She was elected to the House of Commons in 2008, serving after that as Minister of Natural Resources, Labour and Transport. She was also Deputy Leader of the Official Opposition and Conservative Party of Canada. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from St. FX and a Master's in Chemistry from Guelph. She possesses an LLB from Osgoode Law and was called to the Ontario Bar in 1998, and is also currently a Woodrow Wilson Centre Global Fellow of their Canada Institute. So two fascinating and experienced and quite wonderful speakers, and they've been cooperatively working on this Coalition for a Better Future project, which I'm going to turn it over to them and ask whichever one wants to take the lead. What is this Coalition for the Better Future, and where does it come from?
Lisa, do you want me to start and then I'll throw
Please
it to
do.
you? Okay.
Please do.
And first of all, on behalf of Lisa and myself, thank you for inviting us to participate in this important lecture series at the University of Regina. And welcome to everybody online. But if you don't mind, Jim, I'm going to do a special call out to Lisa's and my old colleague, Ralph Goodale, the High Commissioner in the United Kingdom. Ralph, we can't see you, but it's wonderful to know that you're there.
And a former Minister of Natural Resources as well,
Indeed,
Anne.
all three of us.
All three of us
have been ministers of natural resources.
We're all on the wall together.
That's the picture wall, Jim.
The picture
in the
wall.
department.
Yeah, not the other wall, the picture wall.
No. You asked about the coalition. Coalition is now 131 member organizations, and they are big and small. They're private sector. They're organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the BCC, representing some of Canada's biggest corporations. But also nonprofit organizations such as Clean Prosperity and charitable organizations like Imagine Canada, the Goodwill Industries of Canada, Community Foundations of Canada. And one of the things, I think that diversity of interest is where we gain and derive a lot of our energy. And probably this 131 member organization with such diversity is one of the reasons why a fair number of elected officials want to talk to us, because I think it's fair to say that some are at least a little envious of the fact that we have so many people from or organizations from so many different sectors of Canadian society, all focused on inclusive, sustainable economic growth, and everybody working together on that goal. And as we heard from Carolyn Wilkins, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada at our summit last October, it is time to develop a plan for sustained economic growth in this country. But as Carolyn always tells us, it has to be the right economic growth. We cannot leave Canadians behind again, hence inclusion. Nor can we continue, in perhaps unintentionally, to harm our physical environment, our physical world. We need to figure out going forward how we have clean water, clean air, and deal with, of course, the big elephant in every room these days, climate change. So that's what we're focused on, all 131 organizations. And Lisa, I'll turn this over to you now.
Thanks, Anne. Appreciate that. I want to say hi to His Excellency as well. He gets to be an Excellency now, Anne. That's pretty.
Oh, really?
It's even better. Yeah,
Oh
he's
my
an
gosh.
Excellency, the High Commissioner. Ralph, you couldn't see the face that Anne just made, by the way. So that's sorry about that. You'll have to talk to her about it later. But I'm delighted to be here as well. And just picking up from where Anne left off, the reason why 131 organizations came together and quite frankly have stuck with it is because there was a common shared understanding that for a brief shining moment, to quote my friend Anne McLellan, there was a period of time when civil society, corporate Canada, small businesses, the governments, all cooperated with one another. And that was during the time of the response to the COVID pandemic at the early days. And Canadians really liked it. They thought it was the best approach. And quite frankly, from what we're hearing from our members, they too appreciated being part of the bigger picture of how to respond to distinct and, quite frankly, large challenges that our country faces. And that's why people like we have, like Anne mentioned, are still interested because they want to be part of the solution and they have concerns about economic growth in the country. It is not lost on anybody that in the last 7 federal elections, 5 minorities have been yielded. And as a result, the discussions and the, for lack of a better word, the platforms and the debates during these elections tend to be focused on transactional matters. What is bothering you today? What is bothering you most? And how can I make you feel better so that you'll vote for me as a party? And unfortunately, that does not help in terms of long-term economic growth. And that kind of churn doesn't help with long-term economic growth either. So part of the reason why the coalition came together was to show that there was a space for any flavor of government to come to get feedback on long-term economic growth, and knowing that they're talking to a pretty comprehensive group of people. They're not lobbying because we're not lobbyists. Anne and I are actually prohibited from lobbying. But what we can do is we can provide information and we can provide advice. That's what brought us together. What keeps us together and what will keep us together, I think, for a while is the fact that there was agreement from all the organizations that, okay, it's great to come together and say to the governments and public policymakers, economic growth matters, but there needs to be more. And the more is something called a scorecard. Anne, do you have your scorecard?
Right here.
I have mine
right
on my
here.
phone.
See,
There's
everyone.
mine on my phone. There it is. If you go to canadacoalition.ca, canadacoalition.ca, you will see the scorecard there in all her glory, and you'll have an explanation and a breakdown of the distinct measures that we are taking as an organization to determine whether or not, as Anne pointed out, that economic growth that is coming our way is the right kind of growth. And we worked with McKinsey to develop this scorecard, and it was vetted and agreed to by all of the members and organizations and viewed as something that's important for us to measure. So basically, civil society, corporations, businesses want in order to help with big problems. And we have a scorecard that annually we can come out and discuss how we're doing. And what's interesting is that it's not about keeping a government to account. This is about keeping all of us to account. Some of these measures go to corporate Canada. Some of these measures go to us personally. Some of them do go to governments. So it's good for them to take a look at as well. And now those are the two distinct pieces, I think, that make a big difference. The organization is so broad and so diverse that you get a really good sense of the country as a whole wanting to work. And then the second part is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's the second part that's important.
So I do want to push you a little bit on the growth piece, because otherwise I'll have to give up my membership in the Society of Persnickety Academics. I think there's probably an argument that the government's had its foot to the floor on the fiscal and monetary aspects of growth for a generation now, right? We've had low interest rates. We've had almost 15 years now of pretty heavy deficit spending, whether because of COVID. Like we've had a lot of expansionary stuff go on, and I think there's reasonable fears now of kind of a big inflationary headwinds and an overheated labor market. I think you two are talking about a different type of growth, but how does it look different, and what's different about it that's going to change where we've been at for the last 20 years?
Well, first of all, Jim, we are talking about long-term economic growth, right? I mean, right now, sure, if you look at our GDP numbers quarter by quarter, or even over the past year, 18 months, I guess, they look pretty good, right? They're pretty strong. But in fact, we know that before COVID, in fact, our GDP numbers were not keeping up with those around the world to which we would normally compare ourselves, especially in the other G7 countries or the OECD. And so we are talking longer term, realizing that most people, look, we can't predict, right? Are we going to be talking about inflation, stagflation, recession, depression in 6 months, a year from now? We don't know, which obviously creates some uncertainty in terms of economic growth, business investment, and so on. But in terms of the economic growth we're talking about growth, and here I'm going to look at the scorecard, right? Not the 21 metrics. We can talk about those in a little while if you like. But we have 3 big chunks on this scorecard. Growing sustainably. So it's not just about growth. It's growing sustainably. It is winning globally and living better. And that's where, and then when you take those 3 chunks and break them down, you do come to the 21 metrics. But we are not talking about economic growth for the sake of economic growth. It has to be the right kind of economic growth. And as I said at the beginning, it has to be that inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And why do we focus on economic growth, inclusive, sustainable? It's because all those social programs and the quality of life that we as Canadians value and take pride in, we can only afford that. We can only pay for that, Jim, if we actually have that strong, sustainable, inclusive economic growth. So we're not thinking short term. Although we will be, as Lisa said, starting this fall, we will independently track the progress on each of these 21 metrics. But what we're really interested in is where we end up in 2030. Right? And if we hit the targets that we have established in relation to these 21 metrics in 2030, we believe as a coalition, we will be well positioned to be leading the world in terms of the right kind of economic growth. We can no longer have economic growth that bilges CO2 into the atmosphere, right? We can grow exponentially, I suppose, if we pay no attention to the environment, or if we leave behind immigrant new Canadians or Indigenous Canadians, right? But that's not the kind of growth that creates the country we believe we can be.
Yep, and the kind of growth that doesn't allow us to miss out on opportunities such as critical minerals in our society, which is incredibly important to the future of electrification and for the future of decarbonization writ large. And having at least an awareness of the importance of looking at it through the lens of economic growth, I think is incredibly helpful. And I think that's why you have so many people interested in this. And Jim, quite frankly, I mean, to the point of, aren't we already growing economically? Well, there's 131 organizations who are actually quite worried about this. So, I mean, if it was just Ann and I yelling at each other around a table, I get it. But there's a lot of folks who want to be part and want to put their hand up. And I would say one final thing, since one of the novelties, of course, is the fact that Ann and I come from different political parties. And what this shows is that this is a cross-aisle, multi-aisle, this is across the board an effort that is nonpartisan, and that you don't have to subscribe to a certain ideology in order to be part of the planning for long-term economic growth. And I look at it this way: I'm trying to de-weaponize economic growth as an issue for elections and make it more one of those things. Okay, politician at my door, what are you doing about economic growth, so that the voter is asking these questions?
I want to come back to the across the aisle piece because I do think it's really important. But before I go there, I think most of us would agree one of the groups that has definitely not been able to be part of the growth we've had so far is Indigenous Canadians. And you've got some really impressive organizations and individuals as part of the coalition from that community. What's the story they're telling about what needs to change and what the possibilities for growth are?
I'm going to go first, Anne, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
And then you can talk about it.
Go ahead.
So my takeaway from the incredible, I would say, interventions we've received from people like Alicia Dubois is the fact that don't look at us as something to be fixed. Look at us as the fact that we are the future of economic growth in this country. And we have a role to play. And we have a big role to play, and we want to be part of this economic growth, but this economic growth has to be inclusive. So I'll pass over to Anne because she's really invested in the scorecard metrics that we have specifically laid out, because, and you have it in front of you, Anne. It's a nice way of me putting it. But it's there are some really specific items in there that we thought long and hard about in terms of how to measure the appropriate way to determine whether or not we're having growth that makes sense for Indigenous nations.
Just picking up on one thing that Lisa said around that fact that Indigenous Canadians do not want to be seen as a problem to fix. They represent the fastest growing, youngest part of the Canadian nation, and therefore the Canadian workforce.
Yeah. And
they are going to be key. Their active participation in the Canadian economy, but Canadian society more generally, is going to be absolutely key. And we did talk and hopefully listen in the right way to Indigenous stakeholders. And there are a number of our metrics in the scorecard that either directly or indirectly speak to Indigenous inclusion in the workforce. Now, there's one where, in fact, we speak directly to Indigenous participation. And this was one that Indigenous stakeholders told us we had wrong at the first iteration. The metric we've got is the share of Indigenous people in senior management positions. That's our metric that we will be assessing every year. The metric we started with was the number of Indigenous people in the workforce. Indigenous stakeholders said, hey, that's not good enough, because we may and probably will see our participation in the workforce grow dramatically because we are the fastest growing part of the population. But are we all at entry-level jobs? Are we all, at McDonald's? And I'm not in any way saying that McDonald's is not a good place to start your career as an entry-level job. But you don't want to stay there in all likelihood. Or if you do, you want to be the manager or a franchise owner, right? So what we took on board was that it's not good enough to just talk about the percentage of participation, but where is that participation? Is it at a senior level of management where Indigenous Canadians are shaping decisions, influencing decisions in important ways, determining what corporations, what the strategic plans of corporations are, big or small, across the country, having the ability to form and run their own businesses, right? So it's just not good enough to say, oh yes, 60% Indigenous participation in the workforce. What's really important is where they are in that workforce and whether they are able to create and build and influence outcomes. Other metrics that there's one, we do not specifically address Indigenous youth, but it's an important metric which speaks directly to them. Share of youth not in education, employment, or training, the NEAT metric, right? And we know that too many Indigenous young people do not finish school, are not in training, not in employment, right? That's a problem. We are wasting that productive capacity as a nation. We cannot afford to do that any longer, right? So it's in our self-interest to ensure that young people, that we identify those young people who are not in education, employment, and training, and get them the supports and help that they need to be able to ensure that they have the opportunity to contribute to the Canadian economy. And, you know, listening to people at our economic summit, the dignity of work kept coming up, right? So it's not only in the nation's self-interest to make sure we're using the productive capacity of all Indigenous people and all Canadians, but it's also an individual metric in the sense of the dignity of work and the ownership you get when you're in the workforce or in education or training in the ability to contribute. Right? So we have a number of metrics like that. I'm not going to go through them all, but there is no deficit in terms of our discussions with Indigenous Canadians saying now's the time. This is not only coming out of COVID an inflection point generally for the Canadian economy, it is an inflection point for Indigenous Canadians, and they embrace it, right? Because they see the future. And what we have to do is make sure we do not continue the systemic barriers, if we're all honest, the systemic barriers that have existed and been created over decades to their full participation in the workforce.
What you're talking about is, I think, a great example of one thing that I'm curious about. I think a lot of us on the call would have gone to some sort of big thinking conference and been really energized, and then gotten back to our day jobs on a Monday morning and remembered that caffeine and pastry are not in fact food groups, and gone, what do I change? How do I make this happen? And what at the scale of implementation am I talking about doing differently in my organization? Talking about changing the metric for Indigenous people from workforce participation to participation in leadership is a great example of where dialogue can get you on that sort of thing. But were there other surprises when you got all these people around the table where you went, gee, this shifted my understanding of sustainability or of long-term?
Lisa?
Absolutely. It was when we had the charitable and not-for-profit sectors sitting on the stage giving an update on what they experienced in a sense through COVID. And the point was made quite clearly that they are an incredibly important part of the economy, because when the government shut down the business side of the economy, it was the charitable side of the economy that really got invigorated and were really part of the economy at large. So they were saying to everybody else in the room, hey, charity isn't about what you give. Charity is a part of the economy, and it's a big part of the economy. And we too want to have long-term growth, and we too have a view and a vision on what that growth is going to look like. So that was a big aha moment for me, to be honest. It was one of those things. And I guess, and the other thing is the head of Community Foundations of Canada, Andrew Chunahill, when he said, look, inclusion, that's a great word, but it's not about being included. It's about belonging. And that has stuck with me ever since. Like, that has just turned on my head exactly how I view inclusivity. I don't view it as a box to tick anymore. I view it as a sense of being that we have to make sure is in our culture.
Andrew's story, to follow up on what Lisa said, Andrew's story changed my thinking around inclusion and what it must mean going forward. And I will tell the story very quickly that he told us, and it actually brought tears to my eyes when I heard it the first time. Andrew was talking, his family come from Sri Lanka, and they came to Canada when Andrew was a very small child. Andrew went to school here in Toronto, where Lisa and I both are today. And Andrew's name was not Andrew. Andrew's name was a really long Sri Lankan name, and none of his classmates could pronounce it. So he wasn't included, right? He didn't have friends. He'd go home and his mom and dad would say, you know, do you have friends? Do you play with people in the schoolyard? This was when he was 6, 7 years old. And he said, no, Mom, Dad, I don't have friends. And because they make fun of me, they can't pronounce my name. They changed his name to Andrew. Andrew was not his name. They took some of the letters of his name, abbreviated it, and all of a sudden, this 6-7-year-old child whose name was unpronounceable became Andrew, and he had friends and he was included. But Andrew's point is that changing his name was fitting in. Fitting in is not belonging, right?
Yeah.
He and his family were forced to fit in to a construct that was not of their making. And what is more personal than one's name? And you have to change your name to fit in. That is not belonging. And if we are going to create that truly inclusive society in which people feel they belong, then, I think a lot of people should take on board Andrew's story, and a lot of private sector employers and all of us as individual Canadians take that story on and really think through what that means, because I think that gets to you to a place where you have a much deeper understanding of the challenges of real inclusion.
Yeah, and if I may, Anne, one other thing that came to light in a conversation Anne and I had with another organization a couple of weeks ago is the fact that this scorecard not only about measuring how well we're doing, if done right, and if we show progress, that is actually a selling feature for this country in the immigration battle for talent that we're about to encounter in this world. And for me, having this piece right in terms of inclusivity being belonging as opposed to fitting in, it's magical for me. I think that's something that we can really push out in the world, and it gives us a very unique edge when it comes down, and it's already endemic in what we do anyway. The reason why we're so successful is that communities have grown up in different parts of our country that are welcoming, and you feel like you belong when you come here. So I think, for me, it's I would have it in my strategic plan if I was CEO of a big company, that it's not about ticking boxes on inclusivity. It is about making sure that people belong. They're not just trying to fit in.
If I can, Andrew is a really impressive guy, and if I can make a unsolicited advertisement for Community Foundations of Canada, their vital signs reporting at a community level.
Yes.
It's not exactly your scorecard, but it tracks a lot of similar stuff and gives you a really nice kind of local touch point. I haven't asked a political question yet, so let's go to that partisanship piece. I mean, we do live in polarized times, polarized left, right, and polarized federal, provincial. I mean, now that you're out of office and you're able to do this work together, are you seeing ways around that, or is this a bit of a patch that you're building around a pretty confrontational politics? I'd say we see it both federal and provincial levels.
You want to go first, Lisa?
Well, I would say that I would say that perhaps, and it's actually a question from our other former colleague, the Minister Ralph Goodale, has put into the chat function, and it's around the issue of natural resources. And that can be a bit of a flashpoint, and it's not necessarily an ideological one. Sometimes it's a geographical one, to be honest. It's more those who have oil and gas, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador, versus those who don't, Ontario, Quebec, kind of, just to put it into shorthand. So for me, and the rural-urban divide is significant as well too. Those are the two areas, and then that kind of manifests as political divides just by virtue of where we represent, right? So the Liberals win the majority of the urban seats in this country, and the Conservatives don't. They win rural seats, and they win some suburban seats. And so I think under natural resources and balancing the environment with energy and the need for energy and the decarbonization and striving for net zero, I think that is an area where things could get heated. But as we remind ourselves, we're not in the business of saying how you do it. We're in the business of saying you must do it. And when you're growing, we need the growth from whatever decisions you make. And that kind of growth should look like this. And it's not a cop-out, because quite frankly, to have 131 organizations under one umbrella, they're not going to agree on everything, quite frankly. But we all agree that we need long-term growth. So set aside your differences, go lobby on the things that you care about, but together we're going to talk about long-term growth. And we agree that in the environment, long-term growth includes natural resource development. And that is part. I think that's fair, and that it does include natural resource development. Yeah,
absolutely. You talk eloquently about critical minerals. That's natural resource development. It's absolutely key. We cannot let the Chinese, as a matter of geopolitical reality, control the world of critical minerals. And Canada is critical minerals rich. And Lisa talks about this a lot. And if we want to have an electric vehicle industry in this country, we better, working with especially Indigenous communities, we need to figure out how to develop our critical mineral resources, refine them, and get them into those batteries in those electric vehicles, which will help us meet our net zero targets in 2050. I have another example of where there may be a little bit of surprise in some quarters, but I think is a really important example of how cooperation and collaboration can develop. And that is the Pathways, a group of oil sands companies in Alberta. The Pathways group is 6 of the largest oil sands companies. They represent something like 92% of the oil produced out of the oil sands. And first of all, they decided that climate change was real and we better get with the program, because they want to be in business in 2050. And they also know their business will look different in 2050. And so they said some years ago, we're going to form this organization called COSIA, and we're all going to put some money in, and we are going to drive the technology equation. We're going to drive the innovation and the invention equation and share information in ways they had never even shared among themselves, because let's face it, they are in a competitive business, right? So that was the first step, that we want to be in business in 2050. We know we will be doing business differently, and we know we have to drive down our greenhouse gas emissions. That is expected of us, and we need to deliver on that societal obligation. So they form an organization called COSIA. Then that still exists. Now we've got Pathways. And people maybe are surprised, but the 6 oil sands companies aren't fighting the government of Canada. They say, yeah, we're signed on not only to net 50, we've signed on to the ambitious targets of 2030. And they're ambitious, but we believe we can make them, we can hit them, if we get collaboration and support from governments. So what did the federal government do in the last budget? Their number one ask was the investment tax credit for carbon capture storage, right? CCUS, utilizations in there too, right? That was their number one ask of the government of Canada in terms of what will open up vast amounts of private sector investment to get those companies where they need to be by 2030 to meet their targets. Now, they also need some help from the provincial government of Alberta, and they're talking to the provincial government of Alberta in terms of additional supports that they think the provincial government should be providing. But again, the Minister of Finance in Alberta spoke well of that part of the federal budget, right, around the investment tax credit. So in this highly contentious, that which people would expect would be a highly contentious area in our economy, and such an important part of our economy in terms of export dollars and current account, right? There's actually starting and beyond starting a high degree of cooperation, collaboration, and understanding that we all are going to have to work together if we want to get where we need to be, right? Now, am I suggesting this is all sweetness and light? You know, unicorns and balloons or whatever? No, I'm not. But that goes to Lisa's point, that the how. I mean, people can have reasonable conversations and respectful conversations about the exact details of the how you get to 2030 net, or how you get to net zero 2050, but there should be no disagreement on the objective, the outcome, And then it becomes, yes, a respectful, hopefully discussion, cooperative, collaborative about the actual how. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And I hope we stay on this road. And I hope other parts of the Canadian economy and other governments choose to work together to get what various industrial sectors need. Look, that's not easy, right? I'm not suggesting that for a minute, but there are ways to do this. And everybody has to take on board that, we need to understand that we're not going to get where we need to go if we keep bickering with each other, as opposed to coming to the table and saying, this is our goal, 2030 for the pathways, guys. This is the target we have to hit, 2050. These are big, ambitious, audacious things. But, Government of Canada, Province of Alberta, if you come with some investment and some policy reform and some tax measures, and we step up with investment, you know what? We think we can do it. And that will be pretty remarkable. But the spirit, I think, is wonderful.
So I'll remind the audience, we're going to start your Q&A in about 4 or 5 minutes here. So please start throwing me some questions. I mean, I agree with you on the kind of need to get people talking, and that you've built this broad coalition. I mean, there would have been a time where we would have talked about brokerage parties doing this work, right? And there would have been a lot of people left outside the circle, as folks with my haircut get together at the Albany Club. But are we just trying to put a patch on a broken politics by building this type of coalition? I mean, shouldn't this discussion be something that is happening in party politics and in government more easily than it perhaps is?
I don't believe that. I think this is bigger than party politics, to be honest, and left to its own devices over the past 30 years, it really hasn't done a lot of great things. What we see is one government putting out a set of policies, the next government comes in and reverses them, and then the next government comes in and reverses those. There's no through line. There's no narrative on long-term growth. And what we're trying to say is civil society has something to say about this as too. And who's to say that civil society can only exercise their voice through the ballot box? Like, who's to say that's the only way to do it? You should be able to join a coalition through your organization to get your point of view across as well on what matters to you as long-term growth and get information. Anne and I took part in something called Deliberative Democracy. And that was an eye-opener. And it was an experiment, for lack of a better word, and it was on the topic of foreign policy, and it was a question of whether or not Canadians care about foreign policy. And the organizations used technology, developed AI technology, developed at Stanford University, that sought to put a group of 400 people together, assess their points of view on a list of things, educate them, and provide information in a nonpartisan expert level to them for Q&A, and then going back and allowing them to discuss the information, and then going back and reassessing what they thought about the topics after this process was over. We had the opportunity to be a fly on the wall for these AI moderated discussions on foreign policy by ordinary Canadians talking about foreign Arctic sovereignty and what we should be doing with the WHO. Really things that you would think only the pointy head people like we are talk about, but actually it's not the case. People actually care about that stuff. And the takeaway from the Stanford group was this. In the United States, when they do this kind of survey, they do this kind of work, the question that's posed is, how do you feel about the person who's on the opposite side of your issue afterwards? Do you like them more? Do you like them less? And invariably, in the case of Canadians, we actually liked each other more after we had the discussion, and that we understood the point of view we were coming from, and how we didn't agree on the topic, but we were respectful to one another. And they said that's just such a different demarcation than what they're dealing with in the United States. So for me, what that showed is if you give impartial, nonpartisan, expert level information to people, that's not a pitch for a vote, that they will understand, know the numbers, and make their own decisions. And we learned that in COVID as well, because everybody knew the numbers on who was infected, where they're infected, and all that stuff. So for me, this coalition serves the purpose of as well being that place that is a safe place for people to go and get information if they want to have it, or at least find organizations if they want to have it. Why we say information is that we're not reinventing the wheel here. There was some great work that was done by this Liberal government, great work done by my government. I would commend the Emerson report to anybody on Canadian Transportation Act reformation. I also think Dominic Barton did a great job on his work. We know that Monique Leroux and Mark Little did great work on what they did for Navdeep Bains, my colleague now at CIBC. That's all there. I mean, the roadmap probably is there, and it's a matter of letting people know what it is and then getting to the point of implementation.
Another thing, Jim, I might say, and this is probably a little bit more controversial, and I was talking to someone about it this morning. I haven't thought it through yet. So
this could be fun.
No, but it's
and
more
the coalition died this day.
No, it's more theoretical in the sense that I'm not sure that people, millennials and younger, to your point about political parties and brokerage politics that parties used to play, I'm not sure that a lot of younger people see political parties as the vehicle by which they want to have the conversations about the issues that matter to them. I think they're finding other ways. Now, some of it's good online, some of it's not so good online, but online, social media is a way that they're forming their affinity groups and getting together. Nobody should think that millennials and younger Canadians don't care. They care desperately about issues like climate and inclusion and fairness and justice. They care desperately about those things, and economic growth, because it speaks to their ability to buy a house or educate their kids or whatever. But I do think we need to spend more time at places probably like your Public Policy Institute and others, thinking about what do the politics of the future look like if in fact political parties are not the main vehicle by which people engage to talk about the big issues and challenges and try to come to shared outcomes. And Lisa, I think, has made the point that maybe political parties today are one of the worst places to do that because of the polarization, right? And a lot of young people just walk away from that, right? They say, you know what? You guys really, how can we take you seriously? Because these are big, serious issues that are going to impact my world. Stop bickering is my word. I could use others, but they wouldn't be as polite. But stop bickering. And unless you prove your worth to us, maybe we will find other ways to engage, and then obviously take the outcomes of those engagements and put pressure on elected officials, because we're still going to have elected officials, right? So, but maybe it's not the party, the vehicle for the pressure or the influence. I just don't know. But I've been trying to work that through in my mind in terms of what's going on with political parties.
Because there's a lot of anger out there, and you're exactly correct. It's a lot of anger, and it's getting misdirected into political affiliation where it doesn't belong. And maybe there needs to be other places for people to let off steam.
We're getting dangerously close to talking about feelings, which I avoid at all possible costs. So here's a nice technocratic question for you.
Are you going to break into song, Jim?
No, you're safe from that. So in the section on human development, it talks about participation in lifelong learning. And I think one of the interesting challenges of thinking about long-term growth is across an individual's lifespan, right? Thinking about a person's career. And we silo the data across K-12 and universities and immigrants and EI and all federal, provincial, it's all over the place, community organizations. Are you hearing a way to think about people's lifetime trajectory in the labor market out of these conversations? Is there a better way that we can capture and think about being lifetime learners who are upgrading skills in different venues, and who can step up to help with that?
We are actually, and I'm going to let Lisa talk about the PALET program that one of our speakers, Arvind Gupta, talked about at the Economic Summit. It's one example of how one, at least at one stage of someone's life, you can provide them with retraining opportunities and get them into then a higher paying, more challenging job in the workforce, which, you know, when you talk about that trajectory in terms of a person's life in the workforce, you would hope that that trajectory will be on an upward line, right? That in fact, you'll be moving from an entry-level job to a better job requiring higher skill set, more training. Then along with that goes more salary and more benefits and more influence. And one hopes that that is on a continuous upward trajectory. But the only way I think it is through adult ongoing learning. And we trail many other countries in the world in terms of the number of adults that are participating in ongoing continuing education and training. And part of this, a big chunk of this, Jim, lies with the private sector. Our private sector in Canada is not investing the same amount per capita that our competitors are in developed countries in relation to adult training, right? So we do need to take those numbers to heart, and the private sector needs to figure out ways in which they create retraining, upskilling, reskilling programs, right? Whatever the fancy new words are, right? And let me put in a shameless plug for the Institute for Research on Public Policy, whose board I chair, because we have a major research project and have for years in relation to training and upskilling and reskilling and how government needs to collaborate again and coordinate with the private sector to get this right. But it's going to be key. The other thing, let me just put a plug in for those of us who might be a little older. Actually, we cannot have people retiring at 65. We need to keep people in the workforce as long as they are capable and want to be in the workforce. And, you know, 20 years ago, people were saying, oh, well, you guys, you boomers, all get out of the workforce at 65 because you're taking all the jobs. You're job blockers, right, for the younger generation. Well, today, Jim, 1 million jobs today in this country are not filled. They are going begging because we do not have the workforce, either in numbers or the right skill sets, right? The mismatch in terms of the jobs and the skills. And this speaks directly to adult learning and ongoing learning. This is an area where I think governments at all levels and the private sector and the nonprofit sector are working together, should be doing more together in terms of making sure that that trajectory for workers to whatever age they want to or are able to work is on an upward slope, at least for the most important years between probably 28 and 55 or 60, right? But all that to say, Lisa, do you want to say something about the PALET program?
Sure. Yeah, so it was a wonderful program that we highlighted, we spotlighted during our economic growth summit. And what it was is it was very simple premise, which is if you give somebody some different sets of skills that may be part of their abilities already, that you can illuminate them to a different kind of work that they not had been able to think that they would be part of. And the example is, and I think it almost sounds like a movie, like because it's with Good Will Hunting. It almost feels like Good Will Hunting in a sense. But basically what it is there is a woman who was bartender, lots of people skills there, of course. She took this for 6 weeks, learned some IT, learned some other skills of how to take the current complement of tools that she had and turn it into something else. She does sales now, and she's outselling the people in her cohorts. Obviously, she had the skill set. It just needed to be refined and redirected. And quite frankly, since it's a woman, I could say she had to be shown that she should have the confidence to go into another area, because that's a whole different ball of wax. But since Anne is doing personal stuff, I'm going to do personal stuff too. And I'm not going to tout any of the boards I sit on, but a lot of you know that I have a very personal hobby horse of caregiving and dementia related diseases. So here's the thing that I have learned in this space is that training in your company equals opportunity and upward mobility. And when you can't get training or you don't get training, your career is done. And I give it to you in the context of a lot of women in their 50s who run up against that wall of caregiving, either a spouse, in my case, a parent, a grandparent, a loved one, a child, whatever it is. You stop getting extra training and your career then levels off. And then you decide to go part-time, and then you decide, I just can't hack it anymore. So for me, training through life is incredibly important, because that's what's going to make sure that in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, when that caregiving challenge you've been relinquished of it because unfortunately the person has passed away, and you want to come back into the workforce, the same people Anne was saying we need to bring back in, they don't have the training anymore because they stopped getting the training 15 years ago when it became too much for them. And that, to me, that is a big piece of the puzzle. And I watch very carefully what's going on in terms of lifelong learning from that point of view, not because I think people should, I also think people should do it to stave off dementia, quite frankly, to put my other hat on. So I think from a health benefit point of view and from a career benefit point of view, mandatory training is, and making sure we don't let other people fall off the desk when we're looking at caregiving, important things.
Well, I mean, the caregiving piece, I'm always sad, but I'm always happy when I see a column from you or a story from you about Bruce. I mean, it's a really important witness.
Thank you.
I would like at some point to see it not be just a woman's problem, but we're not there yet. I mean, the other category I think that is part of this is diverse abilities, right? Like how do we include and how does your scorecard capture folks that maybe conventionally we would think of as part of the labor force because of kind of long-term ailments? Are there kind of innovations you're hearing on that file as technology's changed? I mean, I think COVID's taught us a lot about work we can do through a screen or with different pieces.
Goodwill Industries was illuminating for that as well when they came in to speak to us about how there's the folks that they give the dignity of the job to are the ones that they're the ones we should be measuring. And that's why we should support charitable and non-charitable groups, quite frankly, because they are going to be doing the heavy lifting in those areas in terms of employment.
Yeah, Goodwill Industries, when they came to the Economic Summit, their national president talked about, she may have put it more elegantly or sensitively, I suppose, but honestly, she was talking about wasted capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because and again, I had to do a gut check, right? And maybe a lot of us, if we're honest, when we see someone with a white cane or a dog by their side for sight, or if another kind of physical disability or a mental disability of some kind, we make assumptions. And those assumptions lock those people out of any real ability to be allowed to participate to their full capacity in the Canadian economy and society more generally. And it's us who are doing that to them, tragically. And at Goodwill Industries, they are able to place with us, and again, it relates back to both our youth and adult training, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through training and on-the-job learning at Goodwill Industries, they are able to place almost all the people in other areas and with other employers in other industries, right? But again, it goes back to that belonging and what real inclusion is in an economy. And we are wasting the talents of an awful lot of people who, if we put aside our assumptions, and not to do harm, but we are being paternalistic. If we put aside our assumptions about what they can do and not do, and listen to them and provide them with the supports the way Goodwill Industries does, we will have a more competitive and a more inclusive workforce.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, in some ways, this kind of retraining question at the population levels, like, super important, and we ignore it because it's a whole bunch of people's stories. I think at the political level, I mean, we've kind of touched on the energy transition already, but I think that's the big piece where it's hard, right? Like, hometown for me is a coal mining town. Retraining is not going to fix that. So I'm wondering, as at the kind of community level, what's the stories that's emerging for the coalition around that big transition and transformation?
Can I just say that maybe retraining is part of the answer for some of the people in that coal mining town, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't assume that it's a blanket. No, retraining doesn't provide opportunities, but I do think it's I think trying again, working together, probably all levels of government, to figure out there's no more coal mining, right? So what else? What are our other strengths and capabilities? And is it possible to attract? I sit on the board of Invest Alberta. And part of our challenge, and it is a challenge, but we're thinking about what kinds of businesses can we attract from around the world into smaller towns in Alberta, right? Right? That you don't have to go to Edmonton and Calgary all the time. And in fact, going back to the natural resources piece, it's we should be able to attract new, diversified business, especially in the ag sector, right? In many of our smaller municipalities and small towns across Saskatchewan and Alberta and elsewhere. But we have to be imaginative. We have to work together with municipal, provincial, and federal governments, and we need to be creative. And we know how to, and we have to also, we've discovered at Invest Alberta, because we're competing against and with other organizations from around the world, not just other investment Canadian organizations when we go out and about. We have to be creative, we have to be imaginative, and we have to know how to market, right? So I'm not saying it's easy. And I really don't like the language of the just transition. I think
Exactly.
we need to get rid of that language. And I have heard that people like Minister Wilkinson don't like the language either, and and are working hard on a different kind of description for what we're really about, which is taking on the fact that even in the oil and gas industry, it's not going to look the same. A big use of natural gas going forward in my province is going to be used to create the hydrogen economy, right? But a lot of the skills that those men and women have right now in the oil and gas sector are going to be key to creating the hydrogen economy, right? And so we need to not, I think, see everything as we go through this big transition to net zero 2050 as a world. We need to see where the opportunities are and how we can do things differently, and how technology and digitalization and other things will actually, I think, make things possible that we never thought of. We can't give up. What's the point of that?
No, and I mean, I think one of my takeaways from today's conversation is going to be just optimism. You guys are optimistic that we can achieve these scorecards, because if we put it on paper, we can do it. I mean, I think that is a piece that's missing.
And we've got a lot of mistakes that we can look at. I grew up in Cape Breton. Like, how do we not make massive mistakes there in terms of any kind of transition from coal and steel, where the industry is just shut down? And that was it. I mean, I'm not living there because there is no future for me there. And Milton provided me the future here in Ontario. And that cannot be the response this time around, because we actually have a long runway here to figure out how we're going to ensure that the parts of the country that are in existence continue to be in existence. You can't empty out one part of the country and shove them all into another part of the country. It's not going to be the way it works. People are going to want to stay where they have roots, and that should be respected. And the last thing I would say from a political point of view, this is where you end up getting the, different points of view in terms of what should be happening. And I think it all comes down to, though, I don't care if you're a liberal or a conservative or an NDP. I do fundamentally believe that you care for your constituents and you worry about their constituents and their jobs. And I don't think there's anyone who's heartless when it comes to this. It's just how it gets manifested. Does it become a political talking point? Does it get lost in the battle? You don't care. No, you don't care. I care more. Look how much I care. That has to be, I get the emotion because it incites people to go to the polls and make change or support your party. But I also get the fact that you need to have rational folks around the table figuring out that path forward and what really can happen and what can make sense. And perhaps we're Pollyannish, but the coalition does have that place where political leaders can come and talk and not be booed out of the room necessarily, test their ideas and actually ask us to help along the way as well, which has happened, Anne, in the case of the coalition.
And that's a great point. And when you talk about optimism, Jim, in fact, ministers in the government of Canada, the government of Ontario, opposition in Alberta, and we're open. Anyone out there in the Saskatchewan government, if you want to talk to us about the coalition and what we're hearing, we're happy. We're available. But now, I'm not exactly sure. I probably forgot where I was going with that point. Sorry, I got so excited about the thought that.
Well, on the Saskatchewan thing, I'm equally excited. As you and I talk about this a lot, we're equally excited about small modular reactors and the future for uranium.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I almost for a minute recaptured the idea that I was, I know. In fact, ministers as I mentioned, people have reached out to us. We've had the opportunity to speak to the Prime Minister. We've had the opportunity to speak to Ministers Wilkinson, Champagne, and the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland. And they were aware of our scorecard. They had it in their hands. They were well briefed by their staff.
They were.
And that tells us that actually people are paying attention. We are making an impact in terms of political elected officials. And Lisa's right. People are asking us, a couple of the ministers with whom we've met, they said, look, you've got this 131 member group. Here are some things that we think you might be able to help us with to get us to a better place in terms of the economic growth agenda. And, we, for example, I'll give you one example. Francois-Philippe Champagne is working on, the digitalization of the Canadian economy. This is one of the things we hear wherever we go, that we're falling behind some other countries in the world, and we really need to invest in the digitalization of the Canadian economy. Well, Francois-Philippe Champagne is working on a digital charter. He said, can you talk to your members about this? Can your members get behind the notion of a digital charter? And Lisa and I said, sure, let's see where we can take this, because all our members realize that digitalization of the Canadian economy, if we learned anything during COVID, it's that digitalization of the Canadian economy is going to be key to efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah.
Well, I think perhaps that note of an invitation to further conversation and a bunch of optimism is where I'll end the Q&A. I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions in the chat, but it was a lovely, lovely conversation. Before we end today, I'm going to turn it back to Lolene. One of the wonderful things about JSGS is the support we get from the Saskatchewan Public Service, and we'd like to recognize that in a particular way before we close for today. So Lolene, I'll hand things back to you. And thank you to Anne and Lisa for a really wonderful conversation.
And thank you, Jim. You were a great moderator.
I appreciate it. It was excellent.
You.
Take care, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And actually, I believe Melissa was going to say something. Melissa, are you there?
Oh, sure. I can jump on. I was waiting to follow your lead on that. Thank you so much, Ms. McLellan and Ms. Raitt, for your thoughtful comments, and Jim for facilitating that conversation. This has just been so inspiring as a leader in the nonprofit sector with an organization that is actually a member of the Canada Coalition.
Yes,
This conversation has just been so motivating, and you so wonderfully articulated that we're really at an inflection point as a country. And I'm just reminded of the saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And I just thank you for the work that you are doing to bring us all together. I will now turn it back to you, Dr. Bradell, to present the 2022 Mentor Award and close things off for us today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you very much to Ms. McLellan and Ms. Raitt. That was a wonderful presentation. I am so pleased to be able to present our Mentor Award and to be able to recognize not one but two outstanding mentors this year. So our Mentors Award this year is going to David Boehm, Assistant Deputy Minister of Advanced Education, and Jessica Kilbride, Executive Lead of Enterprise Initiatives, Ministry of Environment. And this is an annual award that is presented to a mentor in the JSGS internship program who has provided support to multiple interns over the course of the program, as well as making ongoing contributions to JSGS. David and Jessica's unique team-based mentoring approach has provided guidance to over 10 interns, and their leadership and support has inspired their interns to make impacts of their own. Here is what some of their past interns have had to say about David and Jessica. From Zoya Mitchell, she writes, I admire David's humility and diligence in carrying out his duties as a public servant. Having witnessed his unwavering purpose and passion for higher education, has motivated me to find my own passion in life. Our discussion about the environmental pollution after the 2019 Tansley lecture sent me down the path of environmental activism and plastic waste reduction. During this discussion, we talked about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and I remarked that, quote, someone should do something about that. And David turned this into a teachable moment by asking me one simple question: why not you? And I have. I am currently working on launching my own startup that combats this issue. I owe much of my success to our discussion and his encouragement to follow my passion, even if it leads me outside government. I am so much farther now than I would have been if I hadn't had his guidance and support. I could not have wished for a better mentor. Jay Fredette writes, when I learned I would be mentored by an ADM, I was a little worried that I would barely see him and only be invited to a handful of meetings. Yet despite his incredibly busy schedule, David always found time to check in with me and offer support and guidance on the projects I worked on. This made it possible for me to go out and find interesting work to do in the ministry, but always be sure he would be available to help point me in the right direction. He invited me to sit in on many interesting meetings that gave me valuable insight into how a ministry is managed. I learned so much from David during my internship, and those lessons continue to be valuable to me in my career. I would describe David's mentorship style as generous. He is as generous with his time as he is with his expertise. I am very grateful to David for his mentorship and want to join in congratulating him on this well-deserved award. Despite not being my mentor, Jessica was willing to let me sit in on her mentorship sessions with her intern on important topics like freedom of information requests, leadership competencies, and the planning and accountability management system. These sessions were incredibly helpful, and Jessica was always more than willing to answer questions and share her extensive knowledge of the public service. And then finally, from Anastasia Kashiv, she writes, right from the start, Jessica made sure I was comfortable approaching her with questions and allotted time from her busy schedule for mentorship sessions and practical learning sessions. Jessica's mentorship style enabled me to pursue areas of personal interest while providing the appropriate guidance for my success. As my mentor, Jessica was incredibly kind and supportive, ready to offer advice and guidance when I needed it. My internship experience was excellent thanks to her support, and it led to a job offer at the end. I am beyond grateful to have been mentored by Jessica and can confidently say that her knowledge sharing has set me up for success in my public service career. David and Jessica, thank you for your support in developing the next generation of public servants. I'm delighted to let everybody know that Jessica is here today, and I'm just going to turn the floor over to her for a moment. So Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, Lolene. And as Zoom always does, my display of images from people around the table this afternoon changed just as we were getting into this, and a room of interns or students, pardon me, I believe from the U of R popped up. And so it's timely. And those comments are difficult to follow for sure. Very thoughtful. And I'm quite humbled to receive a mentor award this afternoon. I've been so fortunate to have met several impressive JSGS students over the years. And it's meant very much to me to mentor, and I know David would feel the same. The interns always seem to come to their internship with an eagerness to learn and to contribute. They want to do that quite quickly, even though it takes a little bit of time to kind of get acquainted with things in various organizations. So I just want to say, as mentors, I think that we face a unique opportunity to, come to know the interns, to understand their strengths, their interests. In the Saskatchewan Public Service, we want to be a strengths-based organization, and we can make that happen through the internships. But it's really been my pleasure to be a part of the internships over the years. We did have a number of students this last year, and I'm an advocate, and I know David is, for that approach. It works rather well. So thanks again for the kind words, Lolene, for sharing the comments from these great students who are just tremendous people and now contributors to the public service. We're certainly stronger because of the school and the students and the approach to the internships. So thanks again for the recognition. It really means a lot to me.
Thank you, Jessica. We are so grateful to you. So everyone, I'm going to ask you to again ignore the request that everybody be muted. And I'm going to ask you to join me in a round of applause for David and Jessica by unmuting and sharing a round of applause. I see we have a whole class of 807 students. So if you're able to unmute there, I'd expect some wonderful loudness from all of you. And if you're in a situation where you can't be loud, please just use the Zoom reaction features. But everyone, to David and Jessica. Oh, come on, 807 students, you can be louder. There we go. Wonderful. So before I conclude this year's Tansley's lecture, I want to take the opportunity here to give some thanks. First to our speakers, Anne McLellan and Lisa Raitt, for today's informative discussion, and to my colleague Jim Farney for moderating the Q&A. I'd like to thank Jessica Frum, our student MC, a member of our first graduating class for the online MPA students. It's so wonderful to be able to celebrate that new graduating cohort. I'd like to thank our JSGS staff who organized today's event, and particularly Karen Jaster-LaForge for all the work that she does for us here. And finally, I'd like to thank you, our guests, for joining us at this year's Tansley lecture. It's a great pleasure to have you as part of our larger JSGS community. As always, for more information about upcoming JSGS lectures or to learn more about our programs, please visit us online at schoolofpublicpolicy.sk.ca. And with that, I will wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, and please do take care. Bye, everyone.